Hi there, and welcome on the journey to transform culture. I'm Steve, and I'll be your guide. Well, folks, I hope you're having a fantastic day and an even better week. Today, we're going to jump straight into talking about systems. I know, right? What a topic. They're so big, right? So, a lot of times we can be overwhelmed by the idea of systems. In fact, some people are skittish about systems, right? The greater the systems, the more oppressive that it could potentially be toward people. There's a lot of fear relative to systems. We'll touch on a few different types of systems, uh, kind of keep it pretty simple today. I don't want to get too extravagant in the conversation, but we'll talk about it from this perspective. So, if you think of systems, you can think of governments, right? We create roads, rules, laws, all the things to keep the framework, right? That's the framework and the guidelines, right? So that it protects our safety, right, and allows us to thrive. There is a expectancy, right? There's an expectation that we're all going to follow, stay on the same page, right? Respect each other's sovereignty, all of our pursuit of happiness. If you live in the United States, that's what it says in our Constitution. So that pursuit of happiness, right? Well, that's great in the very general sense. We see that and we go, oh, yeah. But we also know, too, that there are those, doesn't matter what system we're talking about, whether it be organizational, governmental, you name the systems. It could be subsystems, right? Uh, uh, it could be the DMV is the system, right? It's a subsystem of your city and your state and so on and so forth. But there are processes or subsystems like that. And you can have people in charge of those systems that can be nefarious. Let's just call it what it is. They can be nefarious and use those systems either to their own advantage or as a mechanism to, I don't want to say oppress, but a mechanism to kind of make it hard on folks, right? Make it difficult for folks, putting in rules in place that don't really have to be there, right? They're excessive. That's where the idea of bureaucracy comes from, right? You're creating this ever layering, I would say the negative idea of bureaucracy is this ever layering of more and more rules and da 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 da, right? So those are some examples of systems and an example of, just a brief talk about the nefarious approach. But oftentimes what happens is that any system that has been created by a group of people has to be maintained by that same group, right? In the United States, we vote and all of these things, right? So there is a level of control or level of responsibility and oversight to a particular level. But oftentimes, and I'm just using that as an example, but it could be an organizational too. If you're not an owner, if you're not taking personal ownership of the system that you're either working in or living under and all these things, if you're not taking personal ownership of how it's stewarded, innovate ideas, try to make it better, right? We can't just think of it this way. Whether you live in society, we can't just go, oh, all these politicians are all bad. Now, I'm not saying there aren't some bad politicians, but I am saying is that it's too easy, right, to just obfuscate our responsibility for the system that we live under. And I'm using that as an example. It's the same example you would use if an employee a team, right, would blame a leader, right, and say, "Oh, well, that leader just doesn't care," right? We can project, and all we're doing really is we're projecting obfuscation. We're just obfuscating. We're taking our responsibility away from ourselves. We're taking responsibility away because we don't want to take the time, uh, the energy, the time, the care to nurture that process and to build it into something that's really magnificent. So a system is just a thing, right? Uh, it's not a person, and it doesn't have a desire, good or bad. It really is going to be a tool, right? The system is just a tool that can benefit as many people, hopefully everyone, right, as possible. But we have to keep in mind that if people don't make themselves heard, and by being heard, that means taking ownership of a system, then that system by default is just going to stagnate and kind of go off into the ditch, right? And it's going to be poor. And essentially, what's going to happen is because it goes off in the ditch, what do you think is going to happen? More rules and controls are put in place. Why is that? Because people aren't taking ownership or care of the system that they own, that their responsibility to manage and so on, right? You could you could go global with this and say, look at our planet. We have to manage our resources, right? We need clean water, we need food, right? Shelter. There's some essentials, energy. There's some essentials that we need. And it's real easy for us to obfuscate and say, well, that's somebody else's problem, right? It happens all the time, and it's happened probably forever, right? And that isn't to say that people don't have to own their part, but if we are able to, it's always good to try to facilitate, right? You don't need to go around messing everybody's system up. And that isn't definitely not the point. The point is if you want to be a help to others, be a facilitator to improve their system, right? And well, in organizations, that's what improvement personnel do. But in all reality, that should just be everyone's general flow and general approach to working anyway. Just like you don't need a safety person. I mean, you do have them, but everyone's job is safety, right? We want everyone to be safe. We want everybody to improve. We want everybody's personal and professional lives to improve so that they thrive. And then the reciprocal nature of that is that their work is higher quality, and then customers are served. And you see how this perpetuates out further and further. So a system isn't good or bad. A system just is. It's really up to us to decide how we sculpt this system into something that works for everyone, right? So it's real easy to demonize a system and say, well, system, I don't subscribe to systems. I know what to do. I know how to do this, and I know how to do that, and whatever. And it is true. There are some fundamentals, right, that if you're doing well or if you're being nefarious. But that being said, and the difficulty here is not everybody does, and oftentimes the people who are complaining don't realize how much the system is actually protecting them while they're complaining about the same system, right? So it's the one you have right now, but the challenge then becomes, hey, what can we do to improve the system? And then improve it. Now, sometimes it's scaling it back, thinning it down, making it less, less difficult, give you less headaches, right? Less steps, less intricacies, less distraction, less hurdles to jump over, less constraints and bottlenecks, less of the worst parts of it, and more of the good parts, right? And then redirecting in areas where we know that are difficult. Sometimes it has to also be understood that certain aspects of any system, organizationally or otherwise, it doesn't matter what we're talking about, what group we're talking about, whatever system applies to you, is that system isn't perfect. And you're not going to, if your concept is well, we need to come up with a perfect system, or I'm not going to be engaged or take ownership. You can't do that. You just simply can't. Part of ownership is understanding things as they are, not as your fantasy hopes that they could be. I mean, it's good to have a vision and good to visualize and dream, right? But ultimately, we got to own the way things are first, and then build, right? Build on those. This is why folks who want to see change happen quickly, rapidly, there are changes that can happen rapidly. But most folks, where it gets difficult is where that change involves them. They want others to change before they'll change. This is why individuals, right? What is your system of life? And does your system of life serve you and others, or does it just serve yourself, right? Because if a selfish person is going to create a selfish system, Okay. Uh, Self-congratulatory narcissistic person is going to create a narcissistic system, right? One that is basically punishing people and creating high levels of bureaucracy um, and excess, right? And really creates an oppressive environment. That's what it does. People don't thrive. They're not feeling joy, and the morale isn't high, right? So there's so many ways to tackle improving a system, but the main thing is to realize systems aren't all bad, okay? And it's really getting involved and taking accountability for the system that you have a problem with. So if you have a problem, now the other part of this too is you may not have a problem with the system. You may think, it's fine, right? But and that's okay because in your day you may not see everything that's going on. So when you hear others have a problem with aspects of a system in your organization, for example, right, different departments, well, they don't like the way we're switching to this, and then the follow-up question is, well, why don't they like that? Not, oh, well, it works fine for us, they should just know why, right? It may be a functional thing that makes their work twice as hard, twice as long, slows productivity, worsens quality, or at least detracts from it, and leaves the customer short-sighted, right? So there may be legit reasons why this particular change in our system isn't working, and we need to readdress some things. Everything isn't always going to be cookie cutter, right? Just like uh, sometimes doing these videos, right? I have to kind of throw out there, hey, we're speaking to many different people from many different industries, so your examples are going to be different. Somebody working in a textile plant, somebody is going to be a different sets of issues than people working developing software. Different from people working in an emergency room, different from people working on a construction site, right? But essentially, a value stream is a value stream, and a value stream is your system. And if you analyze your value stream, then your value stream is just essentially everything from the time resources come in until your customer is served, right? And all the things that happen in between. If your value stream's tight and pretty efficient and effective, great. But is it also, not only is it operate functionally, but is it also that the people who are doing the work, that they're afforded the opportunity to make improvements that they have? Because your system, from your perspective, if you're a leader, for example, stepping back, you may say, oh, well, it works fine. Well, out of sight, out of mind. If you're not seeing what they're having to do to make that work, you don't understand that at the more of the micro level of this system, of your value stream, that folks are struggling, that they've got constraints, and it is really causing grief, right? Typically and hopefully some of the mid-level management is communicating these things, but it is possible, as it happens, where they don't, because they don't want it to appear like that there are any concerns, issues, or whatever. But when you look at your key performance indicators, one of those problem areas is your retention rate. You have high turnover. So your retention is poor. Well, why is it poor? Well, because we're not fixing these issues. I didn't even know we had those issues, right? You didn't know it until you looked at certain aspects of your key performance indicators. Then they spoke to you. They spoke to you in your stats, and it's probably affecting productivity and quality too, right? So when you trace it back, oftentimes what you find is if you allow your team to contribute in the improvement of your system, they will take more ownership of the system, and the system will will move much more positively and start to improve. Right, improve productivity, improve quality, satisfaction from your customers will go up, and your team is happier now too because maybe you made their jobs a little easier and you made the system work better. Right, it's creating multiple wins. It's not just one win here. We want to get wins for everybody because our team is important, right? Our team is important. We don't want to forget that. All right, folks, hope you're having a great day. Hit that good green domino 3 to 5 times a day to uplift, motivate, inspire, and just encourage one another. And when you do that, not only are we helping to transform culture, right? And are we improving the system? Sure, because we're bringing our higher selves, our best attitudes. But we're also not only doing it for culture, but we're doing that for ourselves too. And that's an amazing thing. Don't take it for granted. All right, folks, hit like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, we'll talk to you later.